Hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation today from the Getty Villa Museum in Los Angeles, home of the Getty's Greek, Roman, and Etruscan collection. My name is Shelby Brown, and on behalf of all of us at the Villa, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, Professors Erin Thompson and Patricia Kim, who will consider what to do with a smashed statue from Antiquity and Today. Both speakers are experts in the cultures of the ancient world and engaged in issues of contested public monuments then and now. Erin Thompson is America's only professor of art crime at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. She earned her PhD in ancient Greek, Roman, and Near Eastern art from Columbia University, alongside a law degree from Columbia Law School. Erin is an expert in art law and art crime, and she studies forgery, the looting of antiquities, museum theft, and issues of digital reproduction, along with many other topics. Her book, just out this year, inspired our program today. It is called Smashing Statues: The Rise and Fall of America's Public Monuments, published by Norton. And she covers such topics as protests against monuments and problems with removing controversial public art. Patricia Kim is assistant professor and faculty fellow at New York University's Gallatin School, and also associate director of public engagement at Monument Lab, which is a nonprofit public art and history studio that promotes critical rethinking of the role of public monuments. In her research, her teaching, and curatorial work, Patricia's interests include the art and archaeology of the Mediterranean and Western Asia, and she explores complex issues of gender, race, and post-colonialism, and also relevant to today, power and memory, especially in antiquity and in the present. She's currently curating an exhibition on Hellenistic queens and writing a book about them called Bodies of Power: The Art and Archaeology of Royal Women from the Hellenistic World. As we turn to the program, Patricia will introduce the big picture, Erin will present, and then both will have a conversation before we turn to the Q&A. And I'd like to turn the program over to Patricia Kim.
Thank you so much, Shelby, for this, for that very generous introduction. And I'd also like to thank the Getty for facilitating this program, all the staff behind the scenes that are making this possible. And of course, I'd like to thank my dear colleague, Dr. Erin Thompson, whose brilliant book and work has inspired this gathering. So why do people build monuments? Well, in ancient worlds, monuments could facilitate the celebration of victories and the mourning of serious loss, or they elevated the memories of usually elite or royal individuals. But beyond a specific event or individual, monuments can serve as symbols of ideas and values and as markers of power and prestige. If monuments direct the course of public memory, then memory itself is a very powerful tool that strengthens the bonds within a particular community while potentially creating further divisions among others. Central to identity formation, monuments are memory aids that create physical and conceptual spaces for people to affirm specific narratives of what happened and who was there. But also, and perhaps most urgently, they express and contest power dynamics. Public art raises questions around whose stories are worth remembering, which values and ideas need to be memorized. Or, to follow Haitian anthropologist Michel Rouve-Trouillot, quote, "Any historical narrative is a particular bundle of silences, the result of a unique process, and the operation required to deconstruct these silences will vary accordingly." Such silences and absences speak loudly about which voices and bodies do and do not matter in public space. Take, for instance, the story of the Victory Monument built by the Hecatomnid Queen of Caria, Artemisia II, in the mid-4th century BCE, which is only described by the architect Vitruvius in his 1st century treatise De Architectura. Vitruvius tells us that after the Hecatomnid dynast Mausolus's death, his sister and wife Artemisia came to power as the sole regent of Caria, which at the time exerted control over other cities and places like Chios, Kos, and Rhodes. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with where Caria is, it's located in modern-day southeastern Turkey. Now, when the Rhodians heard about Artemisia II's rise, they became, quote, indignant that a woman would rule over them, and subsequently launched a naval attack against her by invading the capital city of Halicarnassus. Yet we're told that Artemisia learned of their betrayal and strategically organized a successful counterattack that resulted in the slaughter of the Rhodian city's elite leaders and the construction of a bronze trophy in the middle of the city of Rhodes, which represented the queen, marking the Rhodians as enslaved people. Now, afterwards, the Rhodians, who were restrained by a religious scruple that forbids the removal of dedicated trophies, they built a wall around the spot and erected a Greek outpost to prevent anyone from being able to see the trophy, thus obscuring and redacting Artemisia's body and monument from public memory and public space. Now, what does this short story teach us about the status of public art, about issues around gender and race? Vitruvius offers a useful reminder of how monuments work on us. Monuments and statues aren't just inert, static things in the middle of our way when we're walking down the road. They're also things or personhood and the politics of identity entangle with these physical things and statues, making objects vibrant codices of social and political information. The corporeality of Artemisia's victory trophy, in other words, is what prompted the Rhodians to conceal it. If monuments are statements of power and presence in public, then absence is likewise a palpable monumental aesthetic that does significant political work. Now, in the next 45 minutes or so, we'll learn more from Professor Erin Thompson about the various historical situations in past and present of smashed statues, thus illuminating the role that monuments from antiquity continue to play in our lives in this contemporary moment that we live in. Dr. Thompson, over to you.
Thank you. So, more than 200 public monuments in the United States have left their pedestals since the death of George Floyd in the summer of 2020. And most are still sitting in storage while we argue about whether they should stay hidden or be put back up, either in their original locations or somewhere else. And as a classicist, I started to think that the ancient world could teach us some important lessons about disposing of this, so to speak, surplus statuary. The ancients even had better deep storage solutions than we did. Take this portrait sculpture of Ur-Ningirsu, who ruled a Sumerian city-state in what is now Iraq in around 2008 BC. Ur-Ningirsu folds his hands in prayer and would have placed his statue in a temple so the gods would think he was standing there in perpetual adoration. In return, they would grant him a long life. When this divine favor eventually wore thin and Ur-Ningirsu died, another ruler wanted prime real estate in front of the altar for his own votive sculpture, and Ur-Ningirsu's sculpture would have been removed and carefully deposited in a pit dug into the temple floor. Ancient Mesopotamians thought about portraiture like we do nuclear fission, say, an immense power usable for either good or evil. Statues could convince gods to grant you a longer life, but enemies could injure you by attacking your statue. To prevent such magical abuses, priests unplugged the connection between Ur-Ningirsu and his statue before they buried it via a quick ritual decapitation. This led to a lot of complications in the 20th century, since the Louvre Museum had bought the body from the antiquities market and the Metropolitan Museum had bought the head. They put him back together, and now he flies back and forth across the Atlantic every 4 years or so. Bronze is tough and marble can be easily repaired. So most of the monuments to have come down since 2020 were officially removed without too much damage, and even the 35 of them pulled down by protesters remain mostly unscathed. No matter how controversial now, they could easily be put back up. If we don't want our public monuments to remain in storage ready for redeployment, we need to take a tip from the Mesopotamians as to how to lay statues to rest for good. True, damaging a monument isn't really a way to get rid of it permanently, as can be shown by the many statues of Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt from around 1479 BC to 1458. Hatshepsut took power on the death of her husband, initially acting as regent for her 2-year-old stepson, Thutmose III. But Hatshepsut never steps aside from power as he aged. Instead, she ruled for 22 years and constructed an elaborate burial complex with numerous statues showing herself as queen, male pharaoh, or sphinx. After her death, Thutmose, or perhaps his son, reacted by smashing many of her statues. Here's a sphinx midway through repair. Archaeologists have been happily piecing Hatshepsut back together again since the modern excavations began in Egypt. The destruction didn't erase her from history, but it did show how her successors reacted to her memory. We might be horrified at the reasons for their disapproval, but we are certain of their opinions. It's worth asking what future generations will think of our current habit of tucking away removed monuments in expensive climate-controlled storage designed to preserve them indefinitely. The ancient Romans are even more famed for their deliberate destruction of images, thanks to their habit, dubbed damnatio memoriae by modern scholars, of destroying all portraits of people deemed enemies of the state. Emperors were especially vulnerable to this type of posthumous popularity contest. Of the around 70 emperors from Augustus to Constantine, it's hard to count when there's a lot of rebellions, 25 were declared deities after their death, while 26 had their memories condemned. This wooden tondo, now in Berlin, was painted in Egypt in around the year 200. It shows the emperor Septimius Severus, his wife, and his son Caracalla, all with cheerful smiles and rather bulgy eyes. But a scrubbed off circle of gray now floats where the face of the other son, Geta, once was. When they were co-emperors, Caracalla ordered Geta assassinated and his memory erased. Someone in provincial Egypt, far from the capital, was eager to comply. Of course, we still remember Geta like we remember Hatshepsut. Damnatio memoriae is a sign of disavowal, not an actual magical removal of a person from history. What damnatio memoriae did was to change the meaning of the image. The obliteration of Geta's head made the tondo a statement of the owner's obedience to Caracalla. Long story short, you really, really wanted to stay on Caracalla's good side. The power of damnatio memoriae to change meaning without destroying an entire image might give us some good ideas for modifying modern monuments. Take, for example, the now controversial Freedmen's Memorial, which was dedicated in Washington, D.C. in 1876. The monument shows Lincoln holding the Emancipation Proclamation while a newly freed Black man, clad only in a loincloth, crouches at his feet. As soon as the monument was unveiled, Frederick Douglass criticized its representation of this man, quote, on his knees like a four-footed animal. Many others have echoed this criticism, and in June 2020, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton announced she would seek its removal as the monument failed to note, quote, in any way, how enslaved African Americans pushed for their own emancipation. In 1916, Freedman H.M. Murray, a Black journalist and activist, proposed a different solution. Murray argued that the crouching man was an example of the way that American monuments depicted Black people, not as they really were, but as white Americans wished they would behave. Subordinate, obedient, second-class citizens, grateful for their freedom, and admitting that they were unfit for real political or social equality. To stop this message from spreading to new generations of Americans, Murray proposed removing the kneeling figure from the Freedmen's Memorial, transforming it into a memorial to Lincoln alone. This removal, not of a historical person, but of a noxious and false idea, is less damnatio memoriae than, say, damnatio propagandae. The Romans also give us another, even more practical idea, reusing statues by recarving them into a portrait of someone else. When the notoriously cruel Emperor Domitian was assassinated in the year 96, Nerva took over and condemned his predecessor's memory. Portraits of Nerva, like this bust, now in the Getty Museum, show that artists killed two imperial birds with one stone by recarving condemned Domitians into new Nervas. Sometimes this didn't work out so well, like on a set of two reliefs now in the Vatican Museum, which originally showed the gods, including Mars and Minerva, celebrating a triumphal Domitian. Cutting down Domitian's head into a portrait of Nerva gave the new emperor a somewhat ridiculously tiny skull. A petition to swap out Prince for the Columbus statue at the Minnesota State Capitol is just one of many similar proposals today, but I haven't yet heard of anyone thrifty enough to replace a controversial monument by recarving it. However, contemporary artists have been using more temporary means of transforming standing monuments. In Richmond, artists projected portraits of Breonna Taylor, Malcolm X, George Floyd, and others on the pedestal of a statue of Robert E. Lee. Similarly, these figures on a 1954 monument to the Soviet Army in Sofia, Bulgaria, have become superheroes, been doused in pink to apologize for the Bulgarian occupation of Prague, and were painted in the colors of the Ukrainian flag to celebrate the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution. Of course, it's easier to scrub off such additions, as authorities have routinely done, than it is to repair a recarved monument. So far, I've been talking about transformations of monuments in times of peace, but the ancient world also has plenty of examples of wartime transformation of monuments, especially those captured by force and taken home as trophies. This bronze head of the Emperor Augustus, now in the British Museum, was once one of such trophies. In 24 BC, a decade after Augustus's death, an army led by Queen Amaramis of Kush invaded Roman territory in Egypt, hacked off this head, and brought it back home to Meroe in what is now Sudan. They buried it beneath the staircase leading to an altar of victory. For the next 2 millennia, everyone approaching this altar symbolically humiliated Augustus by treading on his face. Something strangely similar happened in 2015 when an artist encased a communist-era statue of Lenin, slated for removal from the grounds of a factory in Odessa, Ukraine, in titanium sheathing, transforming him into Darth Vader. Like Augustus, the buried Lenin gained a new and unexpected power. A transmitter in his helmet beamed out free Wi-Fi. And in the 12th century BC, the Elamites in what is now Iran made an entire collection of captured monuments. One was this massive stele, once over 7 feet tall, carved in the mid-3rd millennium BC to celebrate the victory of Naram Sin, king of the Akkadian people, over the Lulubi tribe in Iran's Zagros Mountains. The colossally sized Naram Sin is shown striding over the puny, prone, dead bodies of his enemies. But 1,000 years later, the Elamite king Shutruk-Nahunte invaded what had once been Naram Sin's territory and ordered the stele taken from Sipar to his capital in Susa, 300 difficult and mountainous miles away. Shutruk-Nahunte's artist gouged out Naram Sin's face, as well as that of the puppet king he had left behind to rule the Lulubi. The artist added another inscription to tell the story of Shutruk-Nahunte's victory and capture of the monuments. His capital held other captured monuments as well, including the famed Law Code of Hammurabi and a now fragmentary victory monument showing Naram Sin's grandfather, Sargon, holding a net full of captured thrashing soldiers. Naram Sin's and Sargon's monuments had sent a message to their subjects, reminding them that the expense of paying the onerous annual tributes the Assyrian kings demanded would be nothing compared to the pain that would come if they rebelled and an Assyrian king had to subdue them once again. But by modifying and moving these monuments, Shutruk-Nahunte showed these threats were finally empty. Several modern collections have also brought together works of outdated propaganda to show how the world has changed, ranging from these Soviet statues on display at Grutas Park in Lithuania to the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia at Michigan's Ferris State University. Unlike the Elamites, though, such collectors have been reluctant to damage the monuments themselves. But perhaps the modern world is finally catching up with the ancients, as Charlottesville's Swords into Plowshares initiative shows. In July 2021, this statue, the focal point of 2017's Deadly Unite the Right rally, finally came down. Later that year, the city transferred the monument of Robert E. Lee to a local nonprofit, the Jefferson School, which plans to commission an artist to use its melted down bronze to sculpt another artwork. Unlike the Lee statue, erected as part of an anti-interracial marriage campaign in the 1920s, the new monument will bring Virginians together instead of driving them further apart. We need more of these creative responses to controversial monuments as we redecorate our nation. We need them to remind us that the transformation we're aiming for is far deeper. And now I'll ask Patricia to come back on so we can chat and take some of your questions.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Thompson. So we do have several questions already in the Q&A box. So for those of you who are curious about all things monuments and smashing them, please feel free to add them to the Q&A chat box. But I have a question for you. It's quite broad, but hopefully productive. So are monuments history?
This is something we see a lot, especially in a worried way, that we will erase history if we take down a monument. But it's important to question the premise there exactly by asking this question, is a monument history? Because they're not. They're more pledges of allegiance than they are history lessons. They are often presenting one very narrow slice of history and one very particular take on that slice of history. And they're doing so for a particular reason. So you have to really ask, why did this monument go up at this time to tell this story in this place? Which is something we often forget to do. We think the monument has always been there, or it's just some sort of neutral attempt to remind us of our history and inspire us, without asking exactly what it's there to inspire us to do. So, for example, in my book, I dug into the history of some Confederate monuments, like the one put up in Birmingham, Alabama, to ask why they went up in the 20th century, so long after the close of the war, and why it went up, this particular one in Birmingham, in a city that was founded well after the close of the Civil War. So it was a monument to a past that the city didn't even have. And that monument was especially interesting because it went up in two parts, 9 years apart. And both of those instances of erection of the monument versus base, and then the obelisk that went on top of it, were in reaction to local workers in the mining industry, very important in Birmingham, were attempting to unionize to ask for fair wages, and were attempting to form an interracial union. And the dedication speeches, if you read them, are all about how the white working class men who are the audience of these speeches should resist this urge to cross the color line, should keep with the self-sacrifice of their Confederate heritage, should obey their social batters in the same way that Confederate soldiers also did so. So that really provides a very particular view of history of the Civil War, and for a particular purpose, namely ensuring that the people who paid for the monument at the time, the mine owners and managers, would continue to profit. So I think that monuments more often erase history by going up than erase history by coming down.
I think that's a really powerful take, especially with a lot of concern around how the removal of Confederate monuments might somehow erase Confederate history. But you described evocatively in your talk the case of Hatshepsut's iconoclasms by Thutmose, and you talk about how that destruction didn't necessarily erase her from history, but rather serves as important evidence for political dynamics. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how vandalism, destruction, and removal are actually informative for the historian and the archaeologist.
Right, so I think one problem is just calling it vandalism in the first place, which I'm not saying that you're problem here, but just everybody does it. But it makes us skip over a step of what is destructive and what is creative, so to speak. So the term vandalism was to mean the deliberate destruction of art was used first during the French Revolution by French royalist authorities who were horrified at the revolutionaries not only taking over power, but deliberately destroying some of the symbols of the king's former power, of aristocratic power. And is an attempt to cast these actions in a negative light. The authorities called vandalism, being like the Vandals, like the Germanic tribe who attacked the sophisticated Roman emperor. And so to call it vandalism is to say that there's nothing worthwhile in it. It's just destruction for the sake of destruction. But we also tend to forget when we see something purely as destruction that this is a part of human life, of the culture of every society, right? If you think about New York City, where we both live, the tearing down of Penn Station, or of various historical, beautiful houses, we keep building and rebuilding things. If you think about, say, the tearing down during the Renaissance of the old St. Peter's Cathedral to build the new one, it's lovely, it's beautiful, it's functional what we have today, but it also involved the decommissioning and destruction of something from the past. But we tend to ignore what theorists have called iconoclasm from above, the deliberate destruction of cultural artifacts by people in power, because that's an accepted part of life. And we focus our criticism on iconoclasm from below, from people who don't hold power, who don't essentially have the power to build something new and shiny to replace the removed or damaged or destroyed monument, to remind us to sort of fill in the gap in our cultural memory, so we won't think of what has been destroyed. So I think it is much more interesting to see vandalism, quote unquote, the modification of monuments, as a very human technique. I think everybody who's felt the urge to take down a photograph of an ex from their refrigerator, or delete an Instagram post or whatever, somebody you're not friends with, should recognize themselves this urge to play with images of the past. And we should examine it to see what it tells us about ourselves. So today, I think some people have criticized arguments about monuments as just sort of meaningless arguments about the past. Everybody should get over it, it's just emotional. But really, these arguments are ways that we have of discussing our future. So it's not a meaningless argument about the past, it's really a crucial negotiation for our future, what we want to have on display in public to inspire ourselves and future generations, by telling them what we think our nation could and should be like.
What kinds of worlds we want to live in, and relationships that we aspire to foster. Speaking of modifications and how it's such a human thing that we find through multiple contexts and historical periods, I want to turn to an audience question from Leah Palmer, who asks, how have art and historical conservators been involved in the treatment of contested monuments? And I want to add on to Leah's excellent question. You did talk a little bit about different materials, bronze versus marble, how some, seem to need more repair. And it got me thinking that it's very easy for us to take for granted monuments, conventional ones, as durable, permanent things, but in fact, they're not. So in answering Leah's question, if you could also comment on maintenance and what else that reveals to us.
Yeah, you're totally right. Monuments are not just a set it and forget it kind of thing. They take ongoing care from being just sort of checked, no holes, no growth, nothing that will continue to damage it, to occasional refurbishings. Sometimes you have to regild or repair or clean it off, or et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot that can go on in a sort of slow motion curation of public monuments. And this can be very expensive. There's a really interesting Smithsonian Magazine investigation published in, I think, 2018, that the authors looked into a decade's worth of tax records and found that at least $40 million in federal tax funds had gone to the maintenance of various Confederate heritage sites over those past 10 years. So monuments are not, they won't keep going unless we keep caretaking for them and paying for that caretaking. And also storage is expensive. So sometimes I get a little frustrated when I think about all these hundreds of monuments in storage, because that's not free either. We're continuing to pay for it while lots of other sites of important American history crumble away for lack of preservation funds. So there are sort of both ethical and practical dilemmas in terms of conservation. And then there are just really cool discussions and negotiations about conserving monuments in terms of their modification or their vandalism or whatever you want to call it. So I have been talking to a couple of curators who are charged with redisplaying monuments that have been through protests and taken down. And there's a question of, how do you, what do you remove? What do you keep on? You could display it with protest signs that were collected during the protests. You could keep letting it rust from where it had been dunked in the water. You could remove the paint that was on it, or you could keep that paint. You can display it standing up as it originally was. You can display it lying down as it was recovered after the protest. Those kind of questions are extremely important to show not only the attitudes of certain protesters or activists, but also in thinking about how the statue will be seen by visitors to the museum. Will it be a sort of site of triumph for certain people and martyrdom for others? Will you encourage, what sort of emotions will you encourage on seeing it? What will you say about it? How will you put it in a context that can help people understand? All those are extremely important and really still very much under debate questions.
When you were talking, it reminded me of what the Bristol museums decided to do with the toppled Edward Colston statue. Edward Colston is an 18th century enslaver whose wealth and trafficking people from Africa basically built the town of Bristol. And they preserved that statue in its toppled state with the graffiti. So I am really curious to see all the kind of creative curatorial directions that folks choose to go in. But I really want to get to another question that maybe that's relevant to this. Janelle Flake asks, should there be federal or other standards, municipal standards, for putting up or removing statues and memorials? So what should there be regulations in place? That's the question.
I'm a lawyer and as well as an art historian and a classicist. And what really astounded me when I read or was researching for my book was how little regulation there are around these issues, especially how little opportunity there is for the public to have their voice heard in decisions about either when a monument goes up or when it comes down. So we think of public monuments as public, right? But that's actually kind of a misnomer. Most of them in the United States went up when they were put in place by people feel wealthy enough to donate them to a municipality and powerful enough to sort of strong arm the municipality into accepting them. Very few of them had any sort of open process of, well, who should we honor in this monument? And that continues today. So while I was writing the book, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and then Governor Cuomo announced, all right, we're putting up a monument to her in her neighborhood in Brooklyn. And I'm like, okay, well, great. I love Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But on the other hand, that's like airdropping in this monument without any public discussion of maybe that community wants to honor somebody else. Seems not exactly the greatest way to go about that. But as little opportunity as there is for public voices to be heard in the creation of monuments, there's even less opportunity once they've gone up. So there's sort of two situations, more or less. In almost all of the former Confederate states, there are state laws that prohibit the removal of almost any monument, really seeking to protect Confederate monuments, but managing to cover a bunch more monuments. Most of these laws are fairly new. They went up after calls to reconsider public monuments started happening after 2015. Sometimes they're more bare than others. There's some just sort of flat out prohibitions. Other states say, well, you need to seek a waiver from the state historic board, but such waivers are in practice really never granted, so it's impossible in practice. But in other states, it's really not much better, because where there is not an explicit law protecting monuments, there's also very, very rarely any procedure for asking for a reconsideration of a monument. So if there's no law whatsoever, there's a sort of bureaucratic hesitation about, do we have the power to do this or not, et cetera, et cetera. And those requests really get ignored most of the time. So one chapter in the book profiles Mike Forcha, an Indigenous activist in Minnesota who had for essentially his entire adult life been asking for decades and decades for a reconsideration of a statue of Columbus at the Minnesota State Capitol. And even in the summer of 2020, there are a lot, he asked again and was told, you have to follow the procedure, here's the procedure to follow, et cetera, et cetera. But finally, hearing rumors that the statue is going to be toppled in the night, he feeling like the statue needed to come down in the daytime, like it had been put up, arranged for it to be pulled down. And it turned out then in the aftermath of that the state authorities admitted there never had been a procedure, that all of these requests had just been ignored. So it's really not surprising to me that acts of what were later by prosecutors in Forcha's case deemed acts of civil disobedience will happen when there's no procedure. So something I would really like to see happen is the creation of ways for us to have these conversations that aren't just empty sort of chatting about it, but that could maybe actually lead to action.
I have two questions that I'm going to combine that I'm going to ask you to keep your legal hat on, from Don Buck and Alexandra Galindo. So Don Buck wants to know, do you think that due process is relevant for the removal of publicly owned statues? And Alexandra asks that they were at another panel where someone suggested that removals should be decided by a community referendum. What is your take on this particular solution forward or path forward?
Yeah, I think that community referendums would be great. I just think that you can't say, oh, well, we shouldn't have done it this way, we should have had a community referendum, when there's no way to get that matter to vote. So you have to create a procedure for this, for statues to be something that should be subject to a community vote, which seems obvious to me, right? There are things, they're public monuments, right? Can't we decide to redecorate our parks or whatever? But too often that venue is been shut off. And I think it's especially important to have these type of community discussions because it's not a this or that, up or down issue. There are many activists that I've talked to that say, like, hey, this work is a beautiful artwork, or I wish I could have signs put up explaining the history, what I see when I see this monument instead of what the monument wants me to see. Or there could be creative interventions in monuments. There's a lot of stuff we can do besides just take them down. But unless we have a procedure for getting to these discussions and new proposals, I think you're going to just see what we see now. Either something stays rigidly in place with the bare minimum of change, maybe a tiny little sign added, probably not, or it's going to get pulled down in the middle of the night. So I'm a fan of contemporary art. I want to see more art happening and more conversations happening.
So to move a little from the contemporary back to the pre-modern or to what we call antiquity, I love in your talk the way that you discussed Damnatio Memoriae as a place for well, political possibility, if you will. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how visible absences or why visible absences are so politically compelling.
Yeah, because precisely, well, first, destruction doesn't work. You and I know as archaeologists that basically everything we study is something that somebody once wanted to throw away for good, but because they didn't use a vaporizing ray, there are traces left behind and we can still think about it. So yeah, just magically wishing that poop something would vanish and it's like it was never there is not going to happen. And it's not good for that to happen. Many statues that are extremely controversial today are parts of history that we now think are painful or wrong to have happened. So to make them go away without discussing how the history turned out that way, how that history influences the present, is sort of worse than leaving the statue up, I think. So yeah, this idea of these visible gaps, the visible erasure is an interesting one. And I have to admit that until recently, I would look at that Severin Tondo, for instance, and think, ugh, so that gray splotch where Gita's head once was is a flaw in it. But now I think it's much more interesting and much more human to see the process of people reevaluating an image, even if we don't agree with it, right? Now we think like Setmos and co were kind of jerks for smashing Hatshepsut's memory. I'm glad it didn't work, but it is a very visible sign of their reaction to their own history.
I actually, sorry, I was reading this cute question from an anonymous attendee and then it disappeared. Okay, because I think that this goes along well with this last question you answered. So someone anonymous asked, are there examples in antiquity that you can think of losers or extensively memorializing their loss?
Can you think of any? I know there's a lot in literature, right? The Greek historians and tragedians loved writing about famous losses of the Athenians, say, in part because it's really common to turn losses into strengths. Look how heroic we were under such stresses, which is in part why the Confederacy became such a part of American self-mythology in all parts of America. During the Great Depression in particular, there's almost a cult of Lee in both North and South because he was seen as someone who maintained his dignity under extreme pressure and loss in an era where so many Americans were trying to deal with a change in economic status, a change in the position of the country in the world. But in terms of spending the big bucks to carve into stone a loss, I don't think so. If anybody else can, if you can put them into the Q&A to make me go like, of course.
I mean, the only thing, I mean, it's hard, I'm racking my brain too. The only example that you might stretch, right, and say this could answer this is, for example, the Periclean building program on the Athenian Acropolis responds to, eventual triumph, but within that, they also kind of memorialize to a certain extent lives lost and structures that were burnt down rather. So perhaps one could stretch and say that is an example, but that's not really, I think, a strong one, right?
There were column drums from the unfinished Parthenon that was burnt by the invading Persians that were reused in the walls of the Acropolis.
Right.
But I'm actually not sure how visible they would have been, or if they would have been faced over with something.
That's a good question. I'm going to think about that. I really liked that anonymous question because of how provocative it is, or it was. So I have another question for you. Um, do you think we need more monuments, Dr. Erin Thompson? Is that something we need?
Fortunately, what I think doesn't really matter because I'm not, the deity of monuments. I'm not in charge. And I think that's what it should be. There shouldn't be somebody in charge. It should be communities deciding, do we need a monument at this particular moment? If you, however, were changing the situation and I were in charge of everything, I think I would say we don't need monuments like the monuments we have, like the traditional monuments, say pre-Vietnam Memorial, pre-Mile Inn. And I think that's really often how the debate is going these days. We've taken one dude off of the horse and we're thinking about, all right, who's the next person we can put on the horse in terms of traditional monuments, which are all dudes on horses. And I'm standing here thinking, why do we need the horse at all? And I agree with Murray, whose work from 1916 I mentioned in the talk. He said that figural monuments that celebrate specific historical figures are never going to be broad enough to represent all the complications of, say, in his case, he was particularly interested in the complications of representing emancipation or the Black role in the formation of America and the Civil War. He said, we're always going to get distracted, essentially, by the particular personal history of the person honored in a monument. And I think that's true. So he, in response to those concerns, suggested that there be allegorical monuments. So you have somebody symbolizing freedom rather than a particular free person. But I think today we have even more powerful tools of abstraction. And you can think about the Vietnam Memorial or the Twin Towers in Light on the anniversary of September 11th, or the memorial foundations at Ground Zero, the memorial fountains, sorry. There are all sorts of ways that 20th century monument makers have come up to stir emotion, to inspire us, without depending on a particular representational, figural person that can run into difficulties. And I think that is a good way to go forward. But again, just my opinion, not the be all and end all.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that when we think about monuments, conventionally speaking, it's like man on horse on pedestal or man on base, or so it is interesting when for someone who works and admires contemporary artists who do temporary installations and performance artworks and activations, really leaning into the transient material forms, even though all materials are transient, but more ephemeral ones, I think are beautiful and compelling, and it's interesting to kind of see where public discourse will take us. I also want to ask another question that's sort of inspired by Will Hodge, who asks, how do you feel how size and scale impacts the logistical ability to potentially alter and refashion monuments? Specifically, Will is thinking about Stone Mountain in Georgia, and speaking of Stone Mountain in Georgia, got me thinking of all of the rock cut monuments throughout Western Asia. Darius, the so-called Great Bisitun inscription, for example, is something that comes to mind, in addition to a number of other Achaemenid and Sasanian rock cut monuments. And so, to tack on to Will's question, what do you think of kind of these non-conventional monuments that still have a monumental quality? I'm thinking of mountains, rivers, for example, maybe trees, so natural heritage. So it's a lot of questions and thoughts, but I'm really curious to hear what you think about any of those points.
Oh, and I hope someone will put into the chat some links to those images of those rock cut monuments. Those are so beautiful and amazing, and such a great example with how to deal with Stone Mountain, because there's not just one monument, carved into the side of a mountain. Subsequent kings would come along and be like, all right, I'm also going to be up there. So there's a variety of monuments that complement each other, that compete with one another. And by having multiple of them in this visible at the same time, you think, okay, there's no one that's the be all and end all. There's no one that's the version of history. It's sort of everybody who can hire enough artisans is going to have their own chance at convincing the audience that this is what they should believe. So by contrast, Stone Mountain, which is the world's largest relief sculpture and the world's largest Confederate monument, carved into a granite cliff a few miles outside of Atlanta, Georgia. It's the subject of one of the chapters of my book, because there have been all sorts of questions of how exactly do you deal with something this large. First, because it's very powerful, right? Adding a little sign isn't going to do much compared with figures that are hundreds of feet tall. And second, because people are just like, well, how are you supposed to get it off there? But I was more or less tickled to learn during the research that the head of Lee, so it's Lee, Jefferson Davis, and Stonewall Jackson riding horses that are carved up there. So the Lee we see up there is the second one carved on the mountain. The first one, carved in the 1920s, was by a sculptor, Gutzon Borglum, who was accused correctly of not doing enough work and of trying to embezzle donations. He was fired from the project. They rehired another sculptor, and then they blew Borglum's head of Lee off of a mountain so the other sculptor could get to work. So, you know, there are certainly ways of removing or adding or et cetera. Borglum, by the way, would go on to sculpt Mount Rushmore, which was also something that let him borrow a whole lot of money without a whole lot of attention to repay it. So what's really holding Stone Mountain in place is not its size, not its material, but again, state law. In the 1950s, shortly after Brown v. Board of Education, the state of Georgia, purchased Stone Mountain and decided to finish this world's largest Confederate memorial in order to demonstrate resistance to federal orders for integration. And B, added the image of a Confederate battle flag to the Georgian state flag for exactly the same reasons. In 2000, now I'm going to embarrass myself by not remembering 2002 or 2012. But in the 2000s, Georgia finally removed the Confederate battle flag image from the state flag, changed the state flag. But in return, in that legislation that removes the image from the flag, they say that the Confederate monument graven on Stone Mountain shall never be changed or added to or removed or recontextualized. They don't use the word recontextualized, but you know what I mean. And so it was a sort of legislative tit for tat as a compromise to get rid of the state flag. So that's what's really standing in the way of changing Stone Mountain instead of its grant.
Oh, that is, I didn't realize that the state government added that clause in to protect a monument, an image that really is about maintaining white supremacy. I have another question. I think we have about 5 minutes left, but I really like John Cirilli's question about Mount Rushmore as a remaking or an erasing, in some sense, the indigenous sacred mountain called the Four Fathers. You talk a lot about remaking and ancient scenarios of remaking monuments. And so I'd love to hear you speak about the power dynamics that are at play at Mount Rushmore specifically.
Mount Rushmore is such a fascinating story. I didn't write about it too much in my book because there have been others who have treated it at length very interestingly. So I reference them in my book. So if you want further reading on Mount Rushmore, and there have been also really interesting both long-form magazine articles and books on Mount Rushmore in Indigenous resistance. So there was an occupation of the monument in the 1970s by Indigenous rights activists. There have been recent protests because, again, monuments are a very powerful way of organizing our thoughts, rallying points for abstract ideas about justice and power. And yes, so more or less without any consideration of whether or not this is a sacred site, Götzenborglum and a variety of businessmen and South Dakota congressmen chose the site as one that was good for sculpting. They wanted to attract tourism and Federal Depression era work dollars, and did so very successfully. Now it's a large part of the local economy, but it was taking over not just land that was never ceded to the United States, but that it was explicitly violating the treaty signed about that particular area. So not just sort of normal land, not just land where the white inhabitants were breaking the US treaty, but very, very deeply sacred land and a sacred land formation as well. Which reminds me of a lot of examples from antiquity of Christian churches being built over or by incorporating ancient temples. The Parthenon, for example, was first a Greek temple, then a Christian church, and then was turned into a mosque, and now has been turned sort of back into a Greek temple, but as an aesthetic object. So the whole of human history is full of like king of the mountain style, I'm here now, I'm controlling this thing, this site of power. And I think we need to recognize that dynamic when we're thinking about monuments. Not just that they are artworks, but they're often placed somewhere, made out of something, incorporating something that is very deeply resonant with people and has been for a long time. And you can't just decide that in a totally sort of removed, neutral, scholarly way, much as I like to think that everything can be totally neutral, removed, and scholarly.
I mean, yeah, there is no such thing as neutrality anywhere, everywhere. I have another question here from another anonymous attendee, actually. What is the current future for the Robert E. Lee statue? Do you know the one that was removed in Richmond, Virginia? Do you know?
I think that Richmond has ceded control of the monuments to a local Black-run organization, nonprofit, who isn't necessarily going to take the statues, but will work with other local institutions to rehouse them. So I think the intent for at least some, if not all of them, is to go back on display. The one I know more about is the Jefferson Davis statue that will probably go back on display in the Valentine Museum in Richmond, which is a local history museum. It's also connected to the workshop of a prominent local sculptor who made that statue. So they will very interestingly use it to talk about the role of that monument in Virginian history, but also use it to talk about the work of that particular sculptor, Valentine, who was known sort of as the sculptor of the lost cause, who pumped out a whole lot of copies of statues that talked up Confederate heroes, that drew sort of racial caricatures with the Black figures in his statues, et cetera. So, and they will also are planning to continue to display that Davis statue, still covered in the paint that he had on him when he was pulled down, which is a sort of glittery pink spray paint, which is really quite delightfully tasteful looking. I love it. So those will, I think, be used for a more powerful intervention into reconsidering history, but there's a risk that a monument, any monument, can go up and just sort of encourage the same thing to keep happening that it was put up to do. I think you really have to intervene into the presentation of something that was designed to make viewers sympathize with the cause it is espousing, or else it's just going to continue to do that.
So I have another question that sort of is more about your book. smashing statues. And I was wondering if you would share with the audience something that you were surprised to learn while writing and researching it.
Oh, there's so many surprising things. Maybe, let's see, that the very first statue honoring a woman, an actual historical woman in American public art, was put up in the late 19th century. It honors a woman named Hannah Duston. There's actually 2 statues of her, one of which was the earliest. It's in Connecticut, and it shows her looking very feminine with this flowy nightdress that's drooping off her shoulder. Her hair is down and flowing around. And in one hand, she has what looks sort of at first glance like a bouquet of wilted flowers, but if you know the history of the statue, you realize it's actually a handful of scalps.
What?
Because of scalps.
Oh my gosh. Nice.
Yes. She is celebrated for having been kidnapped in the 17th century during King Philip's War, and having escaped captivity and coming back home to Massachusetts with in a stolen canoe with a handful of scalps, which she took to prove that she and her fellow captive, who had been her serving girl, had murdered their captors, not the warriors from the Abenaki people who took them, but the family group they had been transferred to. So this statue was put up again, not just out of a random like, oh, who are we talking about today in history? But in precisely that period in the 19th century when westward expansion was in full swing, and settlers were looking for a way to see themselves. So they wanted to see themselves like Hannah Duston, as someone who was provoked into violence, as someone whose violence was justified, as someone whose violence wasn't the only thing about her action, right? She's feminist, she's a mother, instead of sort of just greedy land grabbing oppressors. Who wants to see yourself like that? So her story was incredibly popular in the later 19th century, and now is almost entirely forgotten not because she's been, canceled or erased from history. It's just because the general public doesn't need her anymore. There's not a resistance to westward expansion. We've expanded. We're done. So her story was fascinating in terms of such a clear demonstration of what monuments are used for. And also because I was pretty close to the site of that statue in Connecticut. And so I drove out there one day, and it's fully the most eerie place that I've been, the most eerie monument. Most of her face is missing from a shotgun blast a couple decades ago. I heard about her because she's in the news for having had red paint thrown on her, and it just hasn't been cleaned off. It's still clinging to the monument and scattered on the ground all around. So yeah, I sort of recommend that as a site visit if you want to think about the role of statues in the United States.
Well, and also it gets into these questions around gender as well as race, and how that very much fits into these narratives of American progress in air quotes. And as you were speaking, it reminded me of 2 things. The first relates to the National Monument Audit that I was a part of with Monument Lab, and how one of the most represented historical women in the United States is none other than, oh my gosh, what is her name? The French, now her name just jumped out of my head. The French person, the martyr, oh my gosh, 14th
Oh, Joan of
century.
Arc? Joan of Arc.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Why was that so difficult? Joan of Arc, who had never set foot in the Americas, but as you were saying with Hannah Duston, Joan of Arc probably stands in for something that I'm not quite clear what it is, but you'll find a Joan of Arc monument everywhere in the United States. And it also reminded me of that monumental representation of the Nubian queen, the Meroitic queen Amonitore at the Temple of Epidemic, I believe the so-called Lion Temple from the 1st century CE, where it shows her smiting her enemies, right? As you said, a monumental image of justified violence taken by this queen in this particular historical setting. But I thought how you described that was quite evocative. With the 4 minutes that we have, I'm gonna ask the last question because it's burning. And something that I'm asked a lot as a scholar who's trained in ancient art history, which is, why should classicists, broadly construed, or folks that study the ancient world, care about what's happening in our contemporary moments, right? What is the connection? How do we make connections across such large temporal gulfs, such cultural differences? Why is it so important that we engage as folks who are interested in the ancient world in our present and contemporary moment?
I think classicists should engage in the present moment because we live in the present moment. There's no, and I sympathize, right? I entered graduate school as a retreat from the world, from my problematic family situation, from everything. I thought I can just stay in the basement of the library and only talk to people who have died 4,000 years ago, and I'll be so happy. And it turns out that I was not. That's not actually a way of living. And that not only do I think there is an ethical responsibility to be engaged in the present world for everybody, but I think that everyone has skills to offer based on what they specialize in. So I don't think it's that classicists have some like special contribution that's better than everybody else's. This is their contribution, just like geologists can offer their contribution based on what they know. But I do see the contribution of classicists is to be able to talk about what is a normal human urge. There are so many attempts in current debates to say, well, this is inhuman, this is monstrous, this is unprecedented, this is some new invention that nobody has ever thought about before, to be outraged about monuments or to want to smash a statue or to want to remove a statue. And we as classicists can say, no. This has happened all through human history. What is exceptional is the fact that monuments have been so undebated in the United States for the last 100+ years. So we're just doing what everybody has always done through human history. Now it's our turn. And we should stop saying, stop kicking our heels and saying we don't want it to happen. It's going to happen. Let's just do it in a more constructive way that can bring us together rather than further divide us.
Well, we are at 3:10, which is when I believe this program comes to an end, if I'm not mistaken. Before we wrap up, I wonder, Dr. Thompson, do you have any last words, tidbits, comments, advice? I don't know.
Sure.
Anything else you want to say?
Yeah, I would say that because this moment is so unprecedented in the United States, authorities, whether they be political or scholarly or whatever, don't really have any very firm ideas of what should happen. And there are so many thousands of public monuments in the United States that it's not like anybody is an expert on all of them. So I hope you viewers have been inspired to research your own local monument or reach out to your local museum or historical society or political representative to say, hey, here's what I think should stay up or be modified or whatever. Your voice is really, really valuable right now. So I hope everyone will make their voice heard. And thank you to the Getty for having us. And thank you, Patricia, for such a great question.
Of course, thank you. And I also want to encourage the group to go out and purchase a copy of Dr. Erin Thompson's Smashing Statues. Thank you. I'm going to echo Erin's gratitude to the Getty, and everyone stay safe and healthy during these wild times. Thank you, everyone.